Chapter 5, the Skeletal System, Screencast 3. Now, this screencast is going to focus on the skeleton itself, and don't get caught up in the number of bones. You're going to see different bones. There are a lot of individual anomalies here, and this is just one number that you're going to see. So 206 bones within the body form the skeleton, and basically we describe the types of bone based on their shape. They can be long. Those would be bones of the limbs and fingers, the humerus, the femur, the phalanges. Short bones, those would be carpals, our wrist bones. We have flat bones. Those are going to be the bones of the skull, the sternum, our ribs. And then if you're not one of those, you fall under the irregular category, and that would be your coxal bone and vertebrae. So you should be able to provide examples of the various bone types that are out there. Now, we've talked about the overall function previously, so let's kind of once again go back to that. And when we look at roles, we're looking at support for soft organs and protection. Very, very important functions overall. We look at joints, which is in articulation or where bone meets bone. Some of these joints are going to provide flexible movement of many parts of the body, but not all joints are freely moving, and that's something that we'll see a little bit later. We know that calcium and phosphorus are stored within our bones, and we also know that red bone marrow is responsible for the formation of bone cells. We kind of talked about this previously in the first screencast, but once again, definitely make sure that you're comfortable with the overall function of the skeletal system. Here is an overview of the skeleton itself, and I want to point something out here. We have the axial skeleton and we have the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton are basically the extremities, the upper extremity and the lower extremity, whereas over here we see the bones that actually make up the axial skeleton. On this side is the appendicular. So we have the skull, bones of the skull, okay, the sternum, the ribs, the vertebrae, and the sacrum. Okay. Notice the coxal bones are not part of the axial skeleton. The scapula is not part of the axial skeleton. They belong to the appendicular skeleton. And what we have really is a long axis formed by these bones. So one thing you should be able to do is identify what part of the skeleton the common bones belong to. And the list I would use would be here. Okay, so you should be able to identify these bones as either belonging to the axial skeleton or the appendicular skeleton. Now, the axial skeleton, that's the midline, and as noted, it's made up of the skull, sternum, ribs, vertebral column, and that makes that up. If we look at the appendicular skeleton, those are the bones of the appendages and their attachment structures. You'll hear pectoral girdle or shoulder girdle, arms, pelvic or hip girdle, and legs. So once again, being able to describe the two subdivisions of the skeleton, axial versus appendicular. The rest of this screencast is focusing on the axial skeleton, and the next will be focusing on the appendicular. When we look at the skull, okay, cranial bones and facial bones, now we have the hyoid bone. This is a very interesting bone, and this is one of the questions I ask pretty regularly. The hyoid bone is special because it does not articulate with any other bone in the body. It actually acts as an attachment site for muscles of the tongue, the larynx, and pharynx. So please keep that in mind. Now, another place where you may see the hyoid bone, if you follow any crime shows, the hyoid bone is almost always fractured when someone is actually strangled. Then we have the vertebral column. Okay, keep in mind, vertebral column, not the spinal cord. We're talking about separate structures here. Vertebral column is the bony support that protects the spinal cord. And we have ribs and sternum. Now, if we look at the cranial bones, this is to protect the brain. And I'm not going to go through all of this, okay? But these are the bones that actually make up the skull, okay? And notice some of them are actually named after areas or lobes of the brain. So frontal, parietal, temporal, okay? So once again, we use that quite often along with occipital. So very common, you're going to see a relationship between the name of structures in a given area. And the skull and regions of the cerebral cortex are a really good example of that. Now, there's facial bones, and these make up the maxilla, the palatine, the vomer, zygomatic bones or cheekbones. And then we have sinuses, and these are actually these spaces of air within many of the cranial and facial bones. That's what a sinus is. Here we can actually see an overall view, okay, of the primary bones of the skull, side view, and then looking at it upside down. Here is a really good view of the hyoid, and remember, this is the only bone in the body that is not attached in any way to another bone. Okay. The vertebral column, so one of the questions I ask quite often, how many vertebrae do we see in the main three regions? The main regions are the cervical region, and that's made up of 7 vertebrae. The thoracic, 12 vertebrae, and there's going to be a rib coming off each of one of those thoracic vertebrae. And then we have the lumbar, that's actually 5. Now, the sacrum, that's actually 5 fused vertebrae together. And then we have the coccyx at the very bottom, and that's 4 fused vertebrae. Typically, I will be asking for cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. So you'll see 7, 12, and 5. You can use the mnemonic device here, breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5, as a way to remember, okay, how many vertebrae are in the cervical area, how many vertebrae are in the thoracic area, and the lumbar overall. In between each of the vertebrae is an intervertebral disc, and that actually cushions the vertebrae, and it provides protection, and it assists in movement and flexibility that we find in the vertebral column. Now, take note here, there are natural curves. Those curves are important because keep in mind, if that spinal column was perfectly straight, you would not be able to dissipate forces very well, and you couldn't really protect the spinal cord especially well. So these bends and curves allow for the absorption of force, and that's especially important because remember, we're bipedal organisms. And we can see that here. Okay, so 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and then we have the fused, the sacrum and the coccyx. And here you can actually see in blue, these are the intervertebral discs. You're not going to find intervertebral discs in the sacrum or the coccyx because those are bones that have fused together. Here, okay, we're actually looking at a disc, all right? And so here's an x-ray, okay? We can actually see the disc here and the articulation and the main bodies of the vertebrae over here. These are facets. These actually are articulations with ribs and other vertebrae. So that's terminology. Lots of joints you're going to find within the vertebral column because there's an awful lot of interaction. Now here, you may know someone that has a herniated disc. I think I've shared this with you just recently. I have a chocolate lab, and he was diagnosed with lumbosacral degenerative disease. And that's not uncommon. It's a type of arthritis, which is really what he has. And sometimes that might be due to a disc that's actually herniated. Now here, look at this nice healthy disc. No compression on the spinal nerve. Now here, there's the compression on the spinal nerve, and that might actually present itself as sciatic pain. And sciatic pain is a numbness, tingling, burning that basically runs down the entire leg into the foot. And quite often, it's caused by a herniated disc. Now, the ribs, they're basically protecting the structures that are found within the thoracic cavity. So the lungs and the heart, there's 12 pair, okay? 10 pair are attached to vertebrae in back, the sternum in front. The lowest two pairs, we refer to them as floating. They attach to the vertebrae, but have no real attachment to the sternum. Now, the sternum, that's actually protecting the heart and sometimes called the breastbone. It's not uncommon when someone is administering CPR that the most inferior portion of the sternum is actually fractured. So here we can basically see the main body of the sternum, okay, for the most part. We can see the ribs, okay, these last two, okay, we typically look at as floating ribs because they're not physically attached, okay, overall to the sternum. So something to keep in mind as far as the floaters, okay, so these two right here, and notice no attachment whatsoever. And notice we've got cartilage here that's actually attaching, okay, these ribs to the sternum. And there's that xiphoid process right there. And that makes up the bones that make up the axial skeleton.